Hi guys, let's continue with part 3 of chapter 4, that is the making of a global world. 3.2 Post-war recovery. Post-war economic recovery proved difficult. Britain, which was the world's leading economy in the pre-war period, in particular faced a prolonged crisis. While Britain was preoccupied with war, industries had developed in India and Japan. After the war, Britain found it difficult to recapture its earlier position of dominance in the Indian market and to compete with Japan internationally. Moreover, to finance war expenditures, Britain had borrowed liberally from the US. So, to finance the war expenditures, Britain had borrowed liberally from the US. This meant that at the end of the war, Britain was burdened with huge external debts. The war had led to an economic boom, that is, to a large increase in demand, production, and employment. When the war boom ended, production contracted and unemployment increased. At the same time, the government reduced bloated war expenditures to bring them into line with peacetime revenues. So, at the same time, the government reduced bloated war expenditures to bring them into line with peacetime revenues. These developments led to huge job losses. In 1921, one in every five British workers was out of work. Indeed, anxiety and uncertainty about work became an enduring part of the post-war scenario. Many agricultural economies were also in crisis. Consider the case of wheat producers. Before the war, Eastern Europe was a major supplier of wheat in the world market. When this supply was disrupted during the war, wheat production in Canada, America, and Australia expanded dramatically. But once the war was over, production in Eastern Europe revived and created a glut in wheat output. When once when the war was over, production in Eastern Europe revived and it created a glut in wheat output. Grain prices fell, rural incomes declined, and farmers fell deeper into debt. 3.3 Rise of mass production and consumption. In the US, recovery was quicker. So, US recovered quickly. We have already seen how the war helped boost the US economy. After a short period of economic trouble in the years after the war, the US economy resumed its strong growth in the early 1920s. One important feature of the US economy of the 1920s was mass production. The move towards mass production had begun in the late 19th century, but in the 1920s it became a characteristic feature of industrial production in the US. A well-known pioneer of mass production was the car manufacturer Henry Ford. He adapted the assembly line of Chicago slaughterhouse. He adapted the assembly line of Chicago slaughterhouse in which slaughtered animals were picked apart by butchers as they came down a conveyor belt to his new car plant in Detroit. So, what did he do is that he adapted the assembly line of a Chicago slaughterhouse to his new car plant in Detroit. He realized that the assembly line method would allow a faster and cheaper way of producing vehicles. The assembly line forced workers to repeat a single task mechanically and continuously, such as fitting a particular part to the car at a pace at a pace dictated by the conveyor belt. So the assembly line forced workers to repeat a single task mechanically and continuously, such as fitting a particular part to the car at a pace dictated by the conveyor belt. We have here a figure 21, T model automobiles lined up outside the factory. This was a way of increasing the output per worker by speeding up the pace of work. So, it helped speed up the pace of work. Standing in front of a conveyor belt, no worker could afford to delay the motions, take a break, or even have a friendly word with the workmate. As a result, Henry Ford's car came off the assembly line at a 3-minute intervals, a speed much faster than that achieved by previous methods. The T model Ford was the world's first mass produced car. The first workers at the Ford factory were unable to cope with the stress of working on assembly line in which they could not control the pace of work, so they quit in large numbers. In desperation, Ford doubled the daily wage to $5 in January 1914. At the same time, he banned trade unions from operating in his plants. Henry Ford recovered the high wage by repeatedly speeding up the production line and forcing workers to work even harder. So much so he would soon describe his decision to double the daily wage as the best cost cutting decision he had ever made. So increasing the wage really helped her because he increased the speed of the production line and it forced the workers to work even harder. Fordist industrial practices soon spread in the US. So these practices spread in the US. They were also widely copied in Europe in the 1920s. Mass production lowered cost and prices of engineered goods. Thanks to higher wages, more workers could now afford to purchase durable consumer goods such as cars. Car production in the US rose from 2 million in 1919 to more than 5 million in 1929. Similarly, there was a spurt in the purchase of refrigerators, washing machines, radios, gramophone players, all through a system of hire purchase, that is on credit, repaid in weekly or monthly installments. So they were purchased by using a system called hire purchase, that is on credit, repaid in weekly or monthly installments. The demand for refrigerators, washing machines, etc. was also fueled by a boom in house construction and home ownership, financed once again by loans. The housing and consumer boom of the 1920s created the basis of prosperity in the US. Large investments in housing and household goods seem to create a cycle of higher employment and incomes. Rising consumption demand more investment and yet more employment and incomes. In 1923, the US resumed exporting capital to the rest of the world and became the largest overseas lender. US imports and capital exports also boosted European recovery and world trade and income growth over the next 6 years. All this, however, proved too good to last. By the 1929, the world would be plunged into a depression such as it had never experienced before. Here we have a figure. Here is a figure and box 3. So figure 22, migrant agricultural workers family homeless and hungry during the Great Depression 1936. Many years later, Dorothea Lange, the photographer who shot this picture, recollected the moment of her encounter with the hungry mother. I saw and approached the hungry and desperate mother as if drawn by a magnet. I did not ask her name or her history. She told me her age, that she was 32. She said that day, that is, she and her 7 children had been living on frozen vegetables from the surrounding fields and birds that the children killed. There she sat with her children huddled around her, and seemed to know that my pictures might help her, and so she helped me. She said that day, that is, she and her 7 children had been living on frozen vegetables from the surrounding fields and birds that the children killed. There she sat with her children huddled around her, and seemed to know that my pictures might help her, and so she helped me. 3.4 The Great Depression. The Great Depression began around 1929 and lasted till the mid 1930s. During this period, most parts of the world experienced catastrophic declines in production, employment, incomes, and trade. The exact timing and impact of the depression varied across countries, but in general, agricultural regions and communities were the worst affected. This was because the fall in agricultural prices was greater and more prolonged than that in the prices of industrial goods. The depression was caused by a combination of several factors. We have already seen how fragile the post war economy was. First, First, agricultural overproduction remained a problem. So, agricultural overproduction remained a problem. This was made worse by falling agricultural prices, as prices slumped and agricultural incomes declined. Farmers tried to expand production and bring a larger volume of produce to the market to maintain their overall income. This worsened the glut in the market, pushing down prices even further. Farm produce rotted for a lack of buyers. The second reason was In the mid 1920s, many countries financed their investments through loans from the US. While it was often extremely easy to raise loans in the US when the going was good, US overseas lenders panicked at the first sign of trouble. In the first half of the 1920s, US overseas loans amounted to over 1 billion. Okay, so, while it was often extremely easy to raise loans in the US when the going was good, US overseas lenders panicked at the first sign of trouble. In the first half of 1928, US overseas loans amounted to over 1 billion US dollar. A year later, it was one quarter of that amount. Countries that depended crucially on the US loans now faced an acute crisis. The withdrawal of US loans affected much of the rest of the world, though in different ways. In Europe, it led to the failure of some major banks and the collapse of currencies such as the British pound sterling. In Latin America and elsewhere, it intensified the slump of agricultural and raw material prices. The US attempt to protect its economy in the Depression by doubling import duties also dealt another severe blow to world trade. The US was also the industrial country most severely affected by the Depression. Okay, the US was the industrial country most severely affected by the Depression. With the fall in prices and the prospect of a depression, US banks had also slashed domestic lending and called back loans. Farms could not sell their harvest, households were ruined, and businesses collapsed. We have a figure here. Here's a figure. Figure 23. People lined up for unemployment benefits. US. Photographed by Dorothea Lange, 1938. When an unemployment census showed 10 million people out of work, the local government in many US states began making small allowances to the unemployed. These long queues came to symbolize the poverty and unemployment of the Depression years. Farms could not sell their harvest. Households were ruined and businesses collapsed. Faced with falling incomes, many households in the US could not repay what they had borrowed and were forced to give up their homes, cars, and other consumer durables. The consumerist prosperity of the 1920s now disappeared in a puff of dust. As unemployment soared, so the unemployment increased. People trudged long distances looking for any work they could find. Ultimately, the US banking system itself collapsed. Unable to recover investments, collect loans, and repay depositors, thousands of banks went bankrupt and were forced to close. The numbers are phenomenal. By 1933, over 4,000 banks had closed, and between 1929 and 1932, about 110,000 companies had collapsed. By 1935, a modest economic recovery was underway. Okay, so by 1935, a modest economic recovery was underway in most industrial countries. But the Great Depression's wider effects on society, politics, and international relations and on people's minds proved more enduring. 3.5. India and the Great Depression. If we look at the impact of the Depression on India, we realize how integrated the global economy had become but by the early 20th century. The tremors of a crisis in one part of the world were quickly relayed to other parts, affecting lives, economies, and societies worldwide. In the 19th century, as you have seen, colonial India had become an exporter of agricultural goods and importer of manufactures. The Depression immediately affected Indian trade. India's exports and imports nearly halved between 1928 and 1934. As international prices crashed, prices in India also plunged. Between 1928 and 1934, wheat prices in India fell by 50%. Peasants and farmers suffered more than urban dwellers. Though agricultural prices fell sharply, the colonial government refused to reduce revenue demands. Peasants producing for the world market were the worst hit. Consider the jute producers of Bengal. Okay, so let's discuss about the jute producers of Bengal. They grew raw jute that was processed in factories for export in the form of gunny bags. But as gunny exports collapsed, the price of raw jute crashed more than 60%. Peasants who borrowed in the hope of better times or to increase output in the hope of higher incomes faced even lower prices and fell deeper and deeper into debt. Thus the Bengal jute growers lament. Grow more jute, brothers, with the hope of greater cash. Cost and depths of jute will make your hopes get dashed. When you have spent all your money and got the crop off the ground, traders sitting at home will pay only rupees 5 a mond. Across India, peasants' indebtedness increased. So peasants were the worst sufferers of the Great Depression. They used up their savings, mortgaged lands, and sold whatever jewelry and precious metals they had to meet their expenses. In these Depression years, India became an exporter of precious metals, notably gold. The famous economist John Maynard Keynes thought that Indian gold exports promoted global economic recovery. The famous economist John Maynard Keynes thought that Indian gold exports promoted global economic recovery. This certainly helped speed up Britain's recovery but did little for the Indian peasant. Rural India was thus seething with unrest when Mahatma Gandhi launched the civil disobedience movement at the height of the Depression in 1931. The Depression proved less grim for urban India. Because of falling prices, those with fixed income, say town dwelling landowners who received rents and middle class salaried employees now found themselves better off. Everything cost less. Industrial investment also grew as the government extended tariff protection to industries under the pressure of nationalist opinion. 4. Rebuilding a world economy, the post-war era. The Second World War broke out a mere 2 decades after the end of the First World War. It was fought between the Axis powers, mainly Nazi Germany, Japan, and Italy, and the Allies, Britain, France, the Soviet Union, and the US. It was a war waged for 6 years on many fronts, in many places, over land, on sea, in the air. Once again, death and destruction was enormous. At least 60 million people, or about 3% of the world's 1939 population, are believed to have been killed, directly or indirectly, as a result of the war. Millions more were injured. Figure 24. So here we have a figure 24. German forces attack Russia, July 1941. Hitler's attempt to invade Russia was a turning point in the war. Unlike in earlier wars, most of these deaths took place outside the battlefields. Many more civilians than soldiers died from war-related causes. Vast parts of Europe and Asia were devastated, and several cities were destroyed by aerial bombardment or relentless artillery attacks. The war caused an immense amount of economic devastation and social disruption. Reconstruction promised to be long and difficult. Two crucial influences shaped post war reconstruction. The first was the US emergence as the dominant economic, political, and military power in the Western world. The second was the dominance of the Soviet Union. It had made huge sacrifices to defeat Nazi Germany and transformed itself from a backward agricultural country into a world power during the very years when the capitalist world was trapped in the Great Depression. So the second was the dominance of the Soviet Union. It had made huge sacrifices to defeat Nazi Germany and transformed itself from a backward agricultural country into a world power during the very years when the capitalist world was trapped in the Great Depression. We have a figure here, figure 25. Stalingrad in Soviet Russia devastated by the war. So this is in Stalingrad in Soviet Russia. 4.1 Post-war settlement and the Bretton Woods institutions. Economists and politicians drew two key lessons from interwar economic experiences. The first lesson, an industrial society based on mass production cannot be sustained without mass consumption. Okay, and industrial society based on mass production cannot be sustained without mass consumption. But to ensure mass consumption, there was a need for high and stable incomes. Incomes could not be stable if employment was unstable. The stable incomes also required steady, full employment. But markets alone could not guarantee full employment. Therefore, governments would have to step in to minimize fluctuations of prices, output, and employment. So, market cannot only provide income or employment, but markets alone could not guarantee full employment. So the governments would have to step in to minimize fluctuations of price, output, and employment. Economic stability could be ensured only through the intervention of the government. So, for economic stability, intervention of the government is required. And the second lesson which was learned is that related to a country's economic links with the outside world. So the second lesson is related to the country's economic links with the outside world. The goal of full employment could only be achieved if governments had power to control flows of goods, capital, and labor. So, the goal of full employment could only be achieved if governments had power to control flows of goods, capital, and labor. Thus, in brief, the main aim of the post war international economic system was to preserve economic stability and full employment in the industrial world. So, the main aim of the post war international economic system was to preserve economic stability. This is number one, to preserve economic stability, and number two is full employment in the industrial world. Its framework was agreed upon at the United Nations Monetary and Financial Conference held in July 1944 at Bretton Woods in New Hampshire, USA. Its framework was agreed upon at the United Nations Monetary and Financial Conference held in July 1944 at Bretton Woods in New Hampshire, USA. Figure 26. Mount Washington Hotel, situated in Bretton Woods, US. This is the place where the famous conference was held. The Bretton Woods Conference established the International Monetary Fund to deal with external surpluses and deficits of its member nations. So, the Bretton Woods Conference established the International Monetary Fund (IMF) to deal with external surpluses and deficits of its member nations. The International Bank of Reconstruction and Development, popularly known as the World Bank, was set up to finance post war reconstruction. The IMF and the World Bank are referred to as the Bretton Woods institutions or sometimes the Bretton Woods twins. The IMF and the World Bank are referred to as the Bretton Woods institutions or sometimes the Bretton Woods twins. The post-war international economic system is also often described as the Bretton Woods system. The IMF and the World Bank commenced financial operations in 1947. So the IMF and the World Bank commenced financial operations in 1947. Decision making in these institutions is controlled by the Western industrial powers. The US has an effective right of veto over key IMF and World Bank decisions. The international monetary system is the system linking national currencies and monetary system. The Bretton Woods system was based on fixed exchange rates. In this system, national currencies, for example, the Indian rupee, were pegged to the dollar at a fixed exchange rate. The dollar itself was anchored to gold at a fixed price of 35 US dollar per ounce of gold. So in this system, that is fixed exchange rate system or the Bretton Woods system is based on fixed exchange rate system, and in this system national currencies like the Indian rupee were pegged to the dollar at a fixed exchange rate. The dollar itself was anchored to gold at a fixed price of 35 US dollar per ounce of gold. 4.2 The early post war years. The Bretton Woods system inaugurated an era of unprecedented growth of trade and incomes for the Western industrial nations and Japan. World trade grew annually at over 8% between 1950 and 1970. World trade grew annually at over 8% between 1950 and 1970, and incomes at nearly 5%. The growth was also mostly stable, without large fluctuations. For much of this period, the unemployment rate, for example, averaged less than 5% in most industrial countries. So from the 1950 to 1970, there was growth, or world trade grew at 8% annually, and the incomes increased at nearly 5%. Or it also grew, so the incomes grew at nearly 5%. These decades also saw the worldwide spread of technology and enterprise. Developing countries were in a hurry to catch up with the advanced industrial countries. Therefore, they invested vast amounts of capital importing industrial plant and equipment featuring modern technology. We have here box 4. What are MNCs? Multinational corporations are large companies that operate in several countries at the same time. The first MNCs were established in the 1920s. Many more came up in the 1950s and 1960s as US businesses expanded worldwide, and Western Europe and Japan also recovered to become powerful industrial economies. The worldwide spread of MNCs was a notable feature of the 1950s and 1960s. This was partly because high import tariffs imposed by different governments forced MNCs to locate their manufacturing operations and become domestic producers in as many countries as possible. 4.3 Decolonization and Independence. When the Second World War ended, so, after the end of the Second World War, large part of the world were still under European colonial rule. Over the next 2 decades, most colonies in Asia and Africa emerged as free independent nations. They were, however, overburdened by poverty and a lack of resources, and their economies and societies were handicapped by long periods of colonial rule. The IMF and the World Bank were designed to meet the financial needs of the industrial countries. They were not equipped to cope with the challenges of poverty and lack of development in the former colonies. But as Europe and Japan rapidly rebuilt their economies, they grew less dependent on the IMF and the World Bank. Thus, from the late 1950s, the Bretton Woods institutions began to shift their attention more towards developing countries. Okay, so what happened was that Europe and Japan rapidly rebuilt their economies, and they became less dependent on the IMF and the World Bank. And so the Bretton Woods institutions shifted their attention more towards developing countries. So, what does this tariff mean? Tax imposed on a country's imports from the rest of the world. Tariffs are levied at the point of entry, that is, at the border or the airport. As colonies, Many of the less developed regions of the world had been part of the Western empires. Now, ironically, as new independent countries facing urgent pressures to lift their populations out of poverty, they came under the guidance of international agencies dominated by the former colonial powers. Even after many years of decolonization, the former colonial powers still controlled vital resources such as minerals and land in many of their former colonies. Large corporations of other powerful countries, for example, the US, also often manage to secure rights to exploit developing countries' natural resources very cheaply. At the same time, most developing countries did not benefit from the fast growth the Western economies experienced in the 1950s and 1960s. The developing countries they did not benefit from the fast growth the Western economies experienced in the 1950s and 1960s. Therefore, they organized themselves as a group, the Group of 77 or G77, to demand a new international economic order, NIEO. By the NIEO, they meant a system that would give them real control over their natural resources, more development assistance, fairer prices for raw materials, and better access to their manufactured goods in developed countries' markets. So, the developing countries they formed a group of 77 to demand a new international economic order. So by this what they meant is that they would like real control over their natural resources, more development assistance, fairer prices of raw materials, and better access for their manufactured goods in developed countries' markets. 4.4 End of Bretton Woods and the beginning of globalization. Despite years of stable and rapid growth, not all was well in this post-war world. From the 1960s, the rising cost of its overseas involvements weakened the U.S. finances and competitive strength. The US dollar now no longer commanded confidence as the world's principal currency. It could not maintain its value in relation to gold. This eventually led to the collapse of the system of fixed exchange rates and the introduction of a system of floating exchange rates. So, what is this fixed exchange rates and floating exchange rates? So, exchange rates. They link national currencies for purposes of international trade. There are broadly two kinds of exchange rates. The first one is the fixed exchange rate, and the second one is the floating exchange rate. So, the first one, fixed exchange rates. When exchange rates are fixed and governments intervene to prevent movements in them, and flexible or floating exchange rates. These rates fluctuate depending on demand and supply of currencies in foreign exchange markets, in principle without interference by governments. So the fixed exchange rates would be interference of the government will be there. And for flexible or floating exchange rates, there will be no interference from the government, but it will be driven by the fluctuations in the demand and supply of the currencies in the foreign exchange markets. From the mid 1970s, the international financial system also changed in important ways. Earlier, developing countries could turn to international institutions for loans and development assistance, but now they were forced to borrow. but now they were forced to borrow from Western commercial banks and private lending institutions. This led to periodic debt crises in the developing world and lower incomes and increased poverty, especially in Africa and Latin America. The industrial world was also hit by unemployment that began rising from the mid 1970s and remained high until the early 1990s. So the industrial world was also hit by unemployment, and it began from the mid 1970s and it remained high until the early 1990s. From the late 1970s, MNCs also began to shift production operations to low wage Asian countries. China had been cut off from the post war world economy since its revolution in 1949. But new economic policies in China and the collapse of the Soviet Union and Soviet style communism in Eastern Europe brought many countries back into the fold of the world economy. Uh, so, but new economic policies in China and the collapse of the Soviet Union and Soviet style communism in Eastern Europe brought many countries back into the fold of the world economy. Wages were relatively low in countries like China, so the wages were relatively low in countries like China, thus they became attractive destinations for investments by foreign MNCs competing to capture world markets. Have you noticed that most of the TVs, mobile phones, and toys we see in the shops seem to be made in China? This is because of the low cost structure of the Chinese economy, most importantly, its low wages. The relocation of industry to low wage countries. So the industries are now relocated to low wage countries, stimulated world trade and capital flows. In the last 2 decades, the world's economic geography has been transformed as countries such as India, China, and Brazil have undergone rapid economic transformation. So that's all, guys. See you in my next video. Bye.